Good evening all and welcome. Tonight marks the final video of Birthday Week, with a special surprise coming tomorrow. So I hope you enjoy our collection of cryptid stories. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I have two unsettling experiences. Both occurred in central North Carolina. I lived in the boonies, so a lot of pastures and woodlands. The first one came when I was a young teenager, wrestling with the recent death of a sibling and extraordinarily angry. My home life was not stable, and I spent a lot of time in the woods when things got bad. I even spent the night outside when I didn't feel that safe inside. The forest around my home was essentially a second home, and I had no fear wandering around for hours into the dark. After the most violent argument to the date at home, I decided to take off into the woods for the night. I left the house early and went into the woods the angriest I have ever been. I remember I ended up screaming, crying, and punching at a tree for a while until it clicked in my head that there were no more sounds. North Carolina summers don't exist without the scream of every kind of insect all hours of the day. From there I noticed an encroaching foul odor. I know what dead animals smell like. Hello, country living. And this was like that, but so much more intense and almost sweet. Dread started to set in, and I began walking back home. My instincts were screaming at me to run, so I did. I was a chunky teen, and running was not in my wheelhouse, but I was running quick enough that I crossed the several acres of our property in what felt like seconds. The entire time running, up to crossing the property line, I heard something keeping pace with me from behind. I couldn't see anything from the deck, but I did hear heavy footfalls in the distance. The odor went with them. After that night, I never felt safe in the woods, and I never went back into them. And if I had to be outside at night, every outdoor light was on, and I stayed far from the tree line. The next event occurred roughly 5 years later. Still a teen, less angry, and still in the country. I left for college and work one morning, and crossed a dead doe in the middle of the road. One that turned onto a road I lived on, less than a quarter of a mile away, that required I drive partially into the ditch to avoid hitting her. Not an uncommon sight, but I made a note of it since I would be coming back that evening, and if no one had been to move her, I ran the risk of startling and hitting any nighttime scavengers in the road. The day was normal, other than an unusually late shift at work, courtesy of surprise inventory. By the time I left, it was nearly 1 a.m. and raining. I took my time coming up to where I knew the doe had been, and caught some eye shine on my left. I figured it was a stray animal or a fox taking advantage of an easy meal, and glanced in the side view mirror while I passed. It made eye contact with me in the mirror, but went from what I'm now certain was a crouching to standing position in an instant, and it was tall. I'm dead certain of that. The head looked canine, with an orange-green eye shine. The upper body was all matted down with rain. It was too dark for me to see much other than that, and I was driving very fast. That same odor from the previous experience was now in my car. The same dread had me take the turn that took me right from home and onto a 40-minute detour. I ended up calling my parents and begging them to turn the outdoor lights on for me, and booked it to the door once I was home. I never took that road to or from work after that. I've not encountered that odor again, and the woods, especially those around my own home, still feel like they don't want me there at best. At worst, that single tingle of dread keeps me from venturing too far in. Where I live now, more city than country, what little woodland exists is in my immediate area, and is so thick with homes that any negativity feels weak and muted. I'm not sure what I'm expecting out of sharing this, but I've never told anyone out of fear that I'd be ridiculed for saying some kind of demon chased me in the woods, or that I saw something that kind of looked like a werewolf chowing down on some roadkill. I grew up in the middle of nowhere in Honduras. This country is the spiritual capital of Central America, where all sorts of spooky stuff happens. And you know what else? That's partially why everyone's super into their Christianity here. Now, back in the day, Honduras was no joke. It was the second most dangerous place in the world, after Iraq or Afghanistan, I can't remember which. But let's forget about gangs and violence for a second. Let me tell you about the creepy stuff. You see, when I was a kid, the elders would tell tales about these little goblin-like creatures that would snatch children from the forest. At first, I brushed it off as just folklore, but soon found out it was more real than I could ever imagine. I heard stories from elders and families whose kids had gone missing, all saying the same thing, that they vanished near the well. But when pressed for details, these exhausted kids could only point to spots where there were no wells, and no one ever found these children, dead or alive. Fast forward to when I was around 9. I was chilling with my buddies by the river when we decided to do a spot of exploring, and stumbled upon this eerie clearing in the forest, and smack dab in the middle, an ancient-looking well. Naturally, I was curious, so I headed towards it, but the closer I got, the more it felt like the damn thing was moving away from me. Then, out of nowhere, I started hearing voices, like a bunch of tiny people chatting. That's when I knew I was in deep trouble, so I bolted. But here's the freaky part. When I finally made it home, it was way later than it should have been, and my friends had already left thinking I'd gone home early. Turns out, I had been missing for hours, even though it felt like just a few minutes to me. I went back there as I got older, trying to make sense of it all, but the well and the trail were nowhere to be found. It messed with my head. It was like some weird time warp. I've only shared it with a few people, so that I don't sound crazy, but even after all these years, I still can't wrap my head around it. Who did those voices belong to? I do believe that there is something there, whether they be goblin-like creatures or something else. All I know is I never want to experience anything like that again, and don't wish it upon anyone. This took place in March of 2013. Me and a friend had just been to the movies, and were walking around at around 10:45 p.m. We thought to take a shortcut through the schoolyard of our old school, which had since been abandoned and was in pretty bad shape. As we walked through the schoolyard, we decided to try and get inside the school building and explore a bit. The school consists of 2 wings, so the building is an L shape if viewed from above. It is 3 stories tall and has 3 entrances. The main entrance leads into a kind of main hall which connects the 2 wings. Each wing has staircases in each end of the corridors, which leads to the different floors. One of the windows right by the entrance to the lower wing was actually wide open, so we could easily get in. We were now in the basement. We used our cell phones as flashlights and made sure not to point them towards the windows to avoid being seen. Even though the building wasn't in use, there was still a lot of stuff just left lying around. Music equipment, uniforms, a pool table and chairs, so we were just exploring each room in the basement to see if we could find anything cool. We explored the basement for about 15 minutes before we headed up to the first floor, and we were now in the main hall. There was some kind of tarp or large plastic sheet hanging there to separate the hall and the lower wing for some reason. I assume it was some kind of construction work. We went down one of the corridors and started exploring the classrooms. Every classroom had either been vandalized or suffered some kind of water damage, so everything was pretty much broken down and rotting. In fact, I think we were lucky the floors didn't collapse on us. We had just come out of the third classroom and were in the corridor when we heard someone moving the tarp/plastic sheet in the main hall. This wasn't wind or anything, we could definitely tell someone was physically moving it. We could also hear footsteps, although the rhythm of the steps was kind of strange. It sounded like someone changing their walking pace sporadically. We immediately went inside the classroom to hide, as we thought someone had called security on us. We hid behind the door of the classroom for about 2 minutes in dead quiet. We didn't hear anything else during this time, so we figured it had to be the wind or just random noises and decided to keep going. We went through the corridor and up the stairs to the other end of the main hall and explored the second floor. While we were there, we would occasionally hear some noises, but we just brushed it off as wind. After a while, we had explored the rest of the corridor and decided to walk down the staircase that led from the second floor to the hall. Halfway down the staircase, there was this plateau before the second set of stairs, and this is where things took a turn. We could see the plastic from there and it was moving. We also heard some kind of scratching noise. We stood there for a moment just listening and decided to peek around the corner to see what was making that sound. What I saw scared the living crap out of me. It was some kind of creature, really skinny, almost completely naked, had really thin hairs standing on end and ghastly pale, like corpse pale. The first thing that came to mind was Gollum, but bigger. It was crouching down, scratching the floor, and it made some weird groany noise. It was facing away from us, so I just stood frozen for a while and watched it. I took a step back and pointed at it. I looked at my friend and he peeked around the corner, and immediately I could see his facial expression change to a combination of shock and horror. It was reassuring in a way to know that he saw it too. We just stood there for a good 20 seconds staring at this thing doing whatever it was doing, and the most cliché horror movie thing happened. My friend started backing away slowly, and while doing so stepped on a piece of glass that cracked. And then the creature quickly looked over its shoulder and right at me. I just bolted at that point. We ran all the way to the basement to get out, and on the whole way there I swear I felt like it was right behind us. We ran back to my friend's house, and when we got there we had a kind of debriefing session, making sure we both saw the same thing. I understand if you'd be skeptical. I mean, I would if someone told me this story, but it actually happened. And my friend confirms it to this day. We got a good enough look at it to confirm that it was a humanoid creature of some sort, but didn't really resemble a human. The only logical explanation that I could possibly come up with was a homeless dude that was for some reason naked in an abandoned school. But this was in northern Norway during winter, and you wouldn't survive very long without clothes. I also live in a very small town with an almost non-existent homeless population, so that theory wouldn't really add up. It could also be some kind of animal that found its way inside, but we got a good look at it, and it doesn't look like any animal I'd ever seen before. I have no idea what it was. I'm normally a rational/Occam's razor kind of person, but what we saw then, I don't know how to explain. This story took place on a farm about 4 to 5 years ago. I was living on a farm that had pigs, chickens, cats, and dogs. The pig pen had a pen that was about 25 by 30, and it was built from wire and planks. The planks they could regularly rub against and make a loud noise with. The wire would scrape against the wood and make a loud noise too. The pigs would snort and splash in the mud, and the long and short of it is that it was always loud there. I was walking around after a long day of work with my older brother and mother. It was 10:30, middle of December, so it was cold and the sun was down. and I heard a loud noise similar to one of the pigs screaming. So we go to the pig pen. I ignored it because, as I stated earlier, it was always loud, but after about 3 minutes of the non-stop screaming, I decided something must be wrong, and I checked. So I dreadfully trudged towards into the valley of the worn path, and lo and behold, nothing was wrong. At least, that's what I thought. See, our mother had given us headlamps, and we were required to wear them when we were outside after 9. We lived in Kentucky, specifically a part that lived up to the name Coyote County, so you can understand why she required it. After I turned on my lamp, I immediately saw what their squealing was for. Before me stood a creature on all fours, but looked strangely humanoid in nature. The arms were too long to be human, though. It had a snout and wolf's ears. Its mouth was covered in blood with sharp teeth, and its eyes reflected an eerie white against my headlamp. It was covered in fur and abnormally tall for a coyote or even a bobcat. Before it sat the carcass of a pig. I won't go into the gruesome details of what had been done to it, but imagine a butcher shop, only if all the animals were still alive and squealing around. I screamed and ran away in terror, tripping along the way because I wore cowboy boots back then, the kind with heels, and I ran all the way back to the cabin, which was 4 acres away, and explained what had happened to my brother and mother. My brother didn't believe me, but my mother was concerned and sent him out to check it. He came back saying the pen was broken and that one of the pigs was missing. When I went to check it, it was true. Of course, there was a blood spot where the carcass had been, but the creature was gone. All the piglets were huddled in a corner together, refusing to leave. We spent 2 hours fixing the pen. Then we all went back and everyone laid down. It had been a long time since then, and I still don't know what we saw. For a while I thought I was insane, but I know it happened. We moved soon after that. Can anyone tell me what it could have been? This is an odd story, and I'd love some input on what you believe is going on in my life. It's a weight I've been carrying around and only let out to very few people and friends, but after recent instances, I feel I need more input. This started when I was around 9 years old, living in a house my family and I knew was haunted. Footsteps in the attic, the occasional ghostly figure turning a corner down the hall, things being misplaced and left in the open. We lived in between an old cemetery and an old church, and it was of course an old house. I'd lived in Texas my whole life, and upon researching, I believe that this entity has been following me wherever I go. At 9 years old, my childhood dog passed away. He was a German Shepherd and very sweet, and spent a lot of time laying next to me while I read or watched TV. A week or so after he passed away, I was in my mum's room on her bed reading as I always did. My mum's room was down a tile hallway that had no windows, and we kept the doors closed unless we were inside the room, so the hallway was always dark, and I heard his nails clacking on the tiles, as I was very accustomed to. He'd done it hundreds of times before. He stopped at the end of the hallway outside the door like always, just his dark head poking around the corner of the doorframe. He was so very well behaved and always waited on invitation to enter a room. So I glanced up from my book and patted the bed next to me without thinking, out of instinct. I went back to my book and realized he'd died. I looked up. Nothing was there. I also realized I hadn't heard the tap of his nails walking away. Spooked, I of course left the room. But this is when things became odd, and I didn't notice this correlation for years. One of my very good friend's fathers passed away that night in his sleep from a heart attack. Now we fast forward a few years till I'm about 12, living in Wimberley, Texas. My then best friend was over at my house one night hanging out. We were sitting on my back porch watching the fireflies pulsing in the woods when she tapped me, getting my attention, and she pointed, asking if I saw what she was seeing, and sure enough I did. About 20 feet into the tree line, there was a dark dog-like figure about the size of a husky, but all black, trotting past looking at us. Oddly stunning to look at, we just watched it pass by. We continued to hang out, and when it was time to go, she asked if I wanted to go with her family to the water park, like I had done before, and I declined. I was planning on gaming that night, and the following day when the water park trip was happening. I was woken up the next morning by my mum, informing me that my best friend had passed away in a horrible car accident. That death really rocked my world. It was my first time losing a friend or anyone I knew well. 3 years later, I was 15. My older brother was in the army, and he came home some weekends and we shared a room. I fell asleep and dreamed of the dog walking past the foot of the bed and sat next to my brother's empty bed. The next week, he totaled his car in a DUI accident. The police on scene said if he were an inch taller, his roof would have scalped him, if not decapitated. Then 3 more years later, I'm 18. My brother is out of the military, getting back on his feet after living with us. And I have a similar dream. This time, coming out of our bathroom, and my brother was in bed. The dog just looked and panted. 3 nights later, my brother had his second and final DUI, this time breaking his spine. He's fully recovered, the lucky idiot. And now for our most recent encounter. An old friend of mine became pregnant about a year ago. My girlfriend isn't fond of her, so we don't keep in touch. But I had a dream of my girlfriend and her talking on my couch. I live in Texas still, and she lives out of state, and has for a few years, and the dog was sitting on the ground next to her. I woke up panicked, but it wasn't until a month later I checked on her to discover she had miscarried. The dog never seemed scary or threatening, always calm and warm. It was a calming presence regardless of what came after. It seemed that the dog in my dreams was always an omen of disaster or something terrible happening. I'd love to hear what you all think about this. I lived up north for most of my childhood, hearing stories the elders would tell me. The heartbeat monster is a monster from up north that preys on innocent children. The story happened to me and my uncles and dad. Late at night, we were going to go for a dump run, but the dump wasn't that big back then. We were in the dump road, and we got out of the truck, and we started throwing the trash in a pile to burn it all. But all of a sudden we heard a loud heartbeat. It was like a drum beating over and over. It was loud and scary, and you could feel the vibration. My dad was the oldest in his family, so all my uncles looked at him and he yelled, "Make a fire!" And we all got to work making a fire. And every time that fire would get stronger, the heartbeat would fade. Every time the fire died down, the heartbeat would get louder and closer. We were stuck in this position for 5 hours at best, till we saw first light and that monster went away. Till this day, I'm still scared of that heartbeat, and I get chills just thinking about it. Last summer, I was driving home from work late at night. There's a church with a graveyard on one side of the road and a public transportation place on the other. The sky was lit up with heat lightning, and I thought it looked so pretty. So I decided to pull into the church's small drive to take a quick video of the lightning. The drive faced both the graveyard and the public transportation place. I exited my vehicle and started taking some short videos. Upon returning to my car, I noticed something moving in the public transportation parking lot. Living in a semi-rural area, the place was closed for the night, and the gate separating the transport vehicles from the parking lot was shut. Curious, I pulled into the lot and drove down the fence. I watched a black cat the size of a small dog run behind me on the right side of the first bus inside the gated area. A few seconds later, a medium-sized dog emerged from behind the left side of the bus, 3 buses behind it. The dog looked strange. It had no tail, not even a docked one, and it appeared scraggly. I'd heard about skinwalkers and was getting a bad vibe about this animal, so I left quickly. About 6 months later, I was in my backyard, which is fenced in with a chain-link fence and lined with pine trees. The motion detecting light by our building came on, which was unusual because the lights were new and didn't go off randomly. Curious, I looked towards the light and heard a bark from the pine trees. But it wasn't a normal dog bark. It sounded like a person intimidating a dog's bark, like a distorted woof with a mix of human and canine tones. Terrified, I ran inside, slammed the door and locked it. A month ago I had a vivid dream. Normally I have nightmares, but this one was different. In the dream I was walking past the graveyard next to the church with my dog at around midnight. Suddenly my dog became anxious and scared. I heard a noise and went to check it out. In the graveyard, there was a creature in a human-like form, digging up a grave. It saw me, and I woke up in a panic. This dream made me realize something. Since seeing the black cat turn into a dog, black cats have frequently been crossing my path in odd places, and I began to piece things together. On my way home from a night class at college, I saw a black cat wandering near the school. This is the first time in my 4 years at college that I had seen an animal near the campus, but I brushed it off as a coincidence. However, as I drove into town, I felt an urge to visit the church with the graveyard. I pulled into the parking lot, and a black cat that looked just like the first one I saw appeared from behind a headstone. It sat on one in particular and stared at me for about 5 minutes. I managed to take a picture of it before it vanished behind another headstone and never reappeared. When I told my friend who lives nearby about these events, he mentioned that he had seen a cat transform into a dog too. He suggested I research the grave the cat had been sitting on. Then later that night, he reported that all the dogs in their neighborhood were going crazy. When he went out to check, he heard a child's voice moaning his name from the woods, followed by a dog's cry as if it were being hurt. I did some research and found out that skinwalkers are said to dig up graves and grind their bodies into dust for rituals. I revisited the grave the cat had been sitting on, but it held no significance to me. More recently, a girl I've been talking to experienced something strange. She had no idea what skinwalkers were and didn't believe in the paranormal, but she told me that last night, between 3 and 4 a.m., someone banged on her bedroom window. Too scared to investigate, she stayed in bed. Then she heard a scream outside her window and stayed up the rest of the night in fear. Just when I thought the strange occurrences had died down, things took another eerie turn. My friend Sam and another mutual friend, Carl, were driving to my house late one night. Carl pointed out a black cat running across the road in front of the car. When they arrived, Sam asked Carl to describe what he saw. Carl said the cat ran unnaturally, almost like it had no spine. It was unsettling, like watching a train wreck. You don't want to look, but you can't look away. A few weeks ago, while leaving work at around 10 p.m., I saw a black cat peeking out from behind an AC unit. It stared at me for a good 2 minutes before disappearing. Another night, a friend from college was visiting. We were talking when suddenly we heard a loud howling. We went inside and heard what sounded like a chorus of dogs, but it was more like people imitating dogs. It was eerie, and after 30 seconds it stopped abruptly. Ever since then, I've frequently been seeing black cats crossing my paths or sulking by the end of the road. Is this just a series of coincidences, or could there be something more sinister at play? The sightings of strange events continue to haunt me, leaving me to question the reality of the skinwalker and supernatural. It was the summer of 2002, and my family had booked a holiday in North Wales, UK, in a small seaside town called Morton. I was 7, my brother was 5, and my baby sister was nearing her first birthday. We were also joined by my grandparents and my Aunt Laura. My grandparents had paid for the place that we were staying in and rented a large people carrier so that we could travel together from South London to North Wales without splitting up and facing the inevitable arguments about who rides with whom. When we arrived at the house, I was in awe of the giant white building before us. I asked my nan how much it had cost to rent, and she simply shrugged it off, saying, "It wasn't much." We wanted our family to enjoy ourselves without worrying about the cost, a rarity for a family accustomed to living on the thin line of poverty. The house itself was massive, with 2 floors, large living rooms, a kitchen, diner on each floor, and about 14 bedrooms total. To my 7-year-old self, it seemed more like a mansion than a house. The large garden with its steep hill and jutting rocks was deemed too dangerous for us to play in, but I was fascinated by the swifts that had made nests near the back door. Growing up in the city, I was used to seeing pigeons and house sparrows, so these birds were a delightful change. The most exciting part of the house was choosing a room of my own. At home, we lived in a small 2-bedroom house and shared 1 bedroom, so having my own bedroom was a blessing. I chose a room on the ground floor at the end of the corridor, the furthest from anyone else. My parents chose a room nearby to keep an eye on me and my brother, who also picked a room far from me. The first night passed peacefully, and I woke up refreshed. However, the second night was different. After a day of exploring the nearby beach and sightseeing, we returned for dinner and some TV. As the sun set, my dad called us inside to get ready for bed. I glanced at the swift nest and felt uneasy. The corridor to my room was much darker than the previous night, and I was thoroughly creeped out. I ran to my parents, pleading to sleep in a different room. My dad was about to let up and switch rooms with my brother when my mother intervened, telling me to suck it up. She insisted I stay in the room I had chosen, and defeated, I sulked back into my room, terrified but with no choice but to stay. That night I struggled to sleep, tossing and turning, haunted by the darkness of the corridor and my mother's dismissive words. But eventually fatigue took over, and I fell asleep. However, I was soon awoken by a growl right by my ear. Opening my eyes, I saw 2 red glowing eyes and a large dog, its muzzle snarling and showing long yellowed teeth. It looked like an Irish wolfhound, but with ragged jet black fur. Panicked, I shut my eyes and turned over, but the growling followed me. Each time I turned, the dog reappeared, growling menacingly. Desperate, I reached for the bedside lamp and turned it on. The growling stopped, and the dog was gone. I sat awake for half an hour trying to rationalize the situation as a bad dream. Feeling somewhat reassured, I turned off the lamp and laid down again, but the growling returned, this time at the foot of the bed. I felt the mattress sink as the dog climbed on, its breath on my cheek. I opened my eyes and screamed. My mother rushed in, finding me curled up and sobbing. She dismissed my experience as a nightmare, put me back in bed, and somehow I fell asleep again. The next day, a large bruise formed where the dog's paw had dug into my thigh, and I spent the rest of the holiday hobbling around with my nan's hiding stick. Despite this, the holiday continued without any further incident, and I switched rooms to be closer to my parents. The black dog never appeared again. I enjoyed the rest of our time in Wales, making friends with local kids and playing on the beach. Before we left, the swift chicks hatched, and their morning cries greeted us each day. Years later, a friend in college told me about the legend of the black dog, a spectral creature said to herald death. Researching further, I discovered the Welsh black dog, or Gwilgi, matched what I had seen. 2 weeks after that night, my great-great-granddad passed away from a heart attack. It all started as a warm May night, May 28th to be exact. Nothing was out of the ordinary, procrastinating homework and yelling at each other about some stupid problem in the game. We grew tired of playing video games, so I signed off for the night. I don't live far from a general store, so I thought I might as well hop on my bike, ride there to grab some ice cream soda and sunflower seeds, so I did. The bike ride usually takes about 10 minutes to get there, and the bike ride consisted of going through my neighborhood. A scary-ass bike trail, then another neighborhood. So I put my earbuds in and rode there. I got all the way there just to realize I didn't have my wallet. Very disappointing, since it was just getting dark. I got back on my bike and started to ride back. Usually when I go back, I cut through a backyard instead of taking the trail. It's mainly downhill on the way back, so I don't usually take the trail back. But for some reason, I felt compelled to go down the trail, like a pull. When I was riding down the trail, I heard an inhuman screech. I mean like a mix between a bald eagle and a person. I of course looked towards where the sound was coming from, and saw something I will never unsee. This thing was extremely skinny, super pale, and very tall, on all fours, running at me. When I say extremely skinny, I mean it was like skin and bone, and the legs and arms were extra long. The face was nearly featureless besides a mouth and 2 black eyes. I got the hell out of there as fast as my bike could handle. I know I wasn't just imagining it. I have my license, and I still refuse to go down that trail. In the year of 2011, I was living in rural Spain. Ventamincena, a place near Orce to be exact, with rolling hills and drops and ravines, and cave houses used and abandoned all over. One night we were driving home through the vast countryside on the way back to our place, when I see this thing run towards the back of the car and behind across the road. At first I thought it was a dog, because Spain has a terrible issue for wild and abandoned dogs everywhere. But as my eyes followed it to the verge on the other side of the road, I noticed the size of this thing. It was standing up straight, probably 6 or 7 foot tall, running on all fours. A very sickly pale color, almost glowing in the moonlight with absolutely no body hair at all. The overall vibe was more humanoid than dog, apart from it had an elongated snout. The only way I can describe it was a weird in-between stage in movies when a dude is turning into a werewolf, and is to this day how I describe what I saw. I genuinely don't know what it is that I experienced, but would love your input so that I know what it was. 2 summers ago, I went to a cabin on one of the Great Lakes with my young kids and wife. We were meeting a bunch of family. It ended up being close to 30 people, and the cabin was more like a mansion. For whatever reason, we left late. Something that we were fine with, because the kids would sleep, and I'm the kind of person that can stay awake and go to sleep when I want. So after driving a good 5 hours, I leave this city on the lake that's big enough to have a Target and a Walmart. I still had more than an hour to go, and was surprised to quickly find myself driving on a dirt road. It was a nice dirt road, well maintained, and large enough for 2-way traffic. Nonetheless, I slowed down to about 45. We're in the middle of the forest, and I know the lake is somewhere on my passenger side. Pretty soon I start to see light fog, which quickly gets pretty dense. It's about 1 a.m., and everyone else is asleep. The road was fairly straight. It did have gradual hills, so I would drive in the fog for a while when I was low, and then come out of the fog as I was high. They were very gradual, though. I'm coming out of the fog as the fog starts to thin, and my headlights are at a gradual angle up, and I see something standing on the side of the road. It was a good distance away, maybe 100 feet, far enough that it was just a silhouette, but also in the light of my high beams, I recognize it on a subconscious level. I had seen the shape of this silhouette more times than I can count in my life. It was a cryptid of some description, a creature standing up straight. What stood out immediately were the ears and the hind legs, which appeared to be canine. I'm not a very strong visual thinker. I'm much more verbal and emotional, but I remember the rest of the night more as images, as I'm able to remember what I thought and felt. It looked crazy tall and skinny, but also was standing very still. I've just come out of the fog and I'm driving pretty slow. As I'm getting closer, it starts to look like its shoulders might be moving up and down, as its head is gradually turning with the car. The closer I get, I see that it's covered in hair and looks real, but it hasn't moved. I'm still approaching it, and can start to make out its facial features better. I had already seen the pointy ears from way back, but I got a better sense of its muzzle, which protruded way out and was open, so I could see a bunch of teeth. I couldn't really make out its eyes. I really cannot remember what I was feeling or thinking. I remember it was like I was driving really slow as I passed. I believe just its head moved as I passed it, but also like it was facing me. I could see its eyes now. I was probably 15 feet from it, and I'm 6 foot and drive an SUV, but it was looking down on me. It looked furious. I could swear I could feel it growling. I do remember thinking it looked kind of wrong, kind of like it looked fake or that it couldn't be real. I've never seen the Underworld movies, but it looked like one of those things. At least the body did. I saw this British movie years ago, I think it was called Dog Soldiers, and it looked a lot like one of those. It was huge like those, and it was oddly proportioned, like it wouldn't actually be functional. It was definitely top-heavy. Aside from standing on its hind legs, it did not seem in any way human. Its front legs appeared to be like claws that were very flexible. I don't remember having an opposable thumb, and I don't remember seeing anything that would indicate its gender, though I was mostly focused on the face. After I passed it, something clicked and I dipped. I didn't look in the rearview mirror, and I was sent into fog soon enough. I still had to drive for close to an hour. I just remember sitting super straight, 10 and 2, staring at the road in front of me like I was in a trance. I was definitely spooked that night, almost yelled at my wife when she tried to say that I should empty the car that night. I remember being super relieved that we got the worst room because it had no windows. I didn't say anything to my wife that night. The next morning I left early with my dad to get a rental boat. I wasn't going to tell him. Long story short, stuff kept happening that prevented me telling anyone, and the longer it got, the weirder I thought it would be to tell. I was definitely on edge any time we were outside, but it was also a nice enough house with no beach, and my kids were young enough that we stayed in a lot. I never really tried thinking about it, and I think it just kind of got to the point where if I didn't think about it, I could push it out of my head. Well, as time passes, I discover this thing called Dogman Radio, and it had a picture of the thing I saw. I turned on an episode, and I was in absolute shock, listening to this dude describe exactly what I saw. It opened a door. I did more research. Obviously, I'd never heard of a Dogman, but for the first time ever, I'm finding myself genuinely afraid. I didn't change my laundry one night because the lights in the basement were off, and I nearly crapped myself walking to the car at night and hearing what sounded like a stick crack. I don't remember any dreams, but have woken up several times, soaked in sweat and terrified from these thoughts. I think before I knew that if I told anyone I'd seen it, they'd all ridicule me. But now I know it's real and out there. A friend of mine and I were out hiking through the woods. It was dark out and we were beginning to head back towards home when something came across the path by a fallen tree. It's hard to describe, but it looked like a man in a hooded cloak. It stood and then slowly and silently moved to a tree and kneeled. We couldn't see its face, but we got a feeling that it was watching us. We tried to shrug it off and keep moving. Further down the trail, we saw it again. Being in our early teens, we decided stupidly that we were going to get to the bottom of it, so we started after it, and I began charging it. We screamed and it stopped, and then took off into the woods. Feeling brave again, I grabbed a big spear-shaped stick and took after it. I ran for a bit through the woods, until I could see the outline of it once more up ahead through the moonlight. I knelt and watched another pop up beside it, and then another. I heard movement to the side of me, realizing that whatever the things were, they were surrounding me, and I quickly noped out of there and back in the direction I left my friend. So I know that sounds like the creepy part, but it gets stranger. My friend wasn't where I left him, so I called out to him and he responded a little way away and followed it with, "You gotta see this." So I followed his voice and came to a clearing. It was bright as hell, and floating around the clearing were legit balls of light, almost like the fairy fountains from Legend of Zelda. Those red balls that float near the fountain, except these were pure white. We looked at each other and then hightailed it back to the trail and went home. Definitely the scariest thing I've ever witnessed. I grew up in the Midwest and would spend a lot of time on the family farm, roughly 150 acres of just soybeans and nothing, which was surrounded by a small wooded area. One night when I was 12 or so, I heard some cats fighting outside, so I grabbed a flashlight and started going out. It sounded like it was coming from the woods, so I began making my way there. When I was close to the edge of the trees, I shone my flashlight and saw an eye shine. I thought it was a cat, so I made a noise to try and get it to move and made a few more steps towards it. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't a cat. I remember it ran towards me and made some sort of low rumbling noise. It pushed against my leg and I lost my balance. As I did, I put my hand out to grab onto something and I felt it. It felt like bare skin, no fur. It was about the size of a large dog and it ran off after knocking me over, but that was weird enough to shake me up. Does anyone know what it could have been? About a month ago, I went camping with two of my buddies. While we went to my favorite spot atop a small ridge, in my area, camping is only legal with permits at designated campsites, so I illegally go camping off trail and try my best to leave no trace so that people don't get too mad. The day went normally, and I got to enjoy a nice view with the beginning of fall colors. Once night came, I settled in under a large rock overhanging, and one of my buddies set up his tent right in front of me. The other one set up a bit behind us since there was little room. After maybe an hour of trying to sleep, the wind began picking up. Since we were at the top of a ridge, it got pretty noisy at times, with all the leaves rustling. This whole time I was staring behind the right side of my buddy's tent, simply because it was right in front of my field of view. Suddenly the wind picked up again, and for a split second I looked away from the spot I'd been staring at. When I looked back, I saw a tall grey shape take a step to the right. I distinctly heard the sound of the step, but didn't hear any other noise after that. Even though the fire was going, it was too far to get a good look. So the only thing I remember is that it looked humanoid. The color reminded me of my buddy's, who was in the tent wearing a grey hoodie. So much so that I thought it was him just taking a leak. I was spooked, so I called his name out, but his voice answered me from inside the tent. He got out, and I told him what I saw. We both crapped ourselves, and it took hours till we finally got to sleep. I've settled on it being my imagination or a night hiker, since there is a house not too far from my campsite and I did hear voices at some point. I'm basically asking if anyone knows about any grey creatures. I've never heard of anything like it where I live, and I wanted your thoughts. For reference, this was in the tri-state area. When I was 5 years old, my family took a trip to the Lake District in the UK just for a small holiday. We were staying in this cozy lodge, and one day as I'm looking out the window, I see something I can't quite explain. It's winter, and everything's kind of bare and dead looking. I'm just scanning the scene for a good few minutes, when out of nowhere this massive ball of fur comes bounding or waddling into the forest. I'm glued to the spot, watching it until it disappears into the trees. When I tell my mum about it, she's all like, it's probably just a hare or rabbit. But this thing was like the size of 2 stacked car wheels. I start racking my brain trying to figure out what it could be. I keep my eyes peeled every day, scanning the area, but I never caught sight of that weird furball again. I wonder what on earth it was. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed this week of new stories. If you did, I would love to get your thoughts down below. Do you want this to become something we do more frequently? Video every day? I don't know how frequently I'll be able to do it. Definitely not all the time. But maybe we could implement it every once in a while. So please feel free to comment. Huge thanks as always to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen for your continued support. It really means the world to me. Hopefully see you tomorrow for the surprise. And until then, stay awesome. And I'll see you in the next one.